All right. On that note, we will go ahead and get started. Good morning for the people it's morning, and good afternoon for the people it's afternoon for. Happy Friday, Tom. And
Happy.
Javi.
Yeah.
So I am, of course, joined by my co-founder here at the Puerto Rico Energy Forum, Tom King, and founding director of Fundación Borencana, and our producer and all things behind the scenes and program associate at Fundación Borencana for PreCap, Javier Vélez. Hi, Javi. Good to have you joining us today. This is our first conversation of 2026 that we're officially recording, and it feels fitting to focus on two things. One is the kind of political bombshell that has just erupted, and in sort of celebration of the governor's 1 year in administration in office, they've announced the escalation of the legal battle and lawsuit against LUMA Energy, the consortium that manages the transmission and distribution system, and of course that's going to lead us into an outlook for 2026, and so this is, I think, fitting that it will be the underlying. It will determine both the technical performance, political credibility, and economic growth prospects for the island in this year. And so, not only is it the topic du jour on the island and within the political and energy classes, but it is the right way, I think, the right lens to really understand what's going to happen in 2026. So. We're going to dive into a couple of elements. One is the timeline about how did we get here, and what is it that we're really fighting over, and what are the implications, one way or another, both on a technical, cost, political, creditability. What are the implications for the different operators within this entire system, whether it's the actual operators in Genera and Luma, or the authorities in PREPA, P3A, Fortaleza, the governor's office, et cetera, the FOMB, federal government, FEMA funds, you name it. There's a lot of different folks at play here. And again, what does that mean for the island in 2026? So I think we're going to go ahead and get started. LUMA is the grid operator, and so we're gonna go into a little bit of these details. They were awarded a 15-year contract in June 2020 to administer the works overseeing the operations and maintenance of the transmission and distribution system, and in doing so, they are explicitly an agent of PREPA, the Puerto Rico Electric Power Authority, and work to a certain degree at the discretion of that authority. In June 2021, LUMA entered into a supplemental agreement indicating that they would begin to perform work and they would begin operating the T&D system, but that the 15-year contract they were awarded as a result of this competitive bidding process would not begin until a very specific qualifying event, which namely is the PREPA's exit from Title III bankruptcy under PROMESA. PROMESA is the Puerto Rico Oversight, Management, and Economic Stability Act that was passed by the U.S. Congress in 2016. It created the mechanisms by which Puerto Rico and its different corporate agencies and public corporations would be able to access a bankruptcy proceeding that otherwise wasn't available to the island because of nuanced jurisdictional holes, really, in the rulings, in the law.
Yeah.
The agreement, the supplemental agreement, is signed, and this is important, by the P3A, the Public-Private Partnership Authority, and PREPA on one side, and LUMA on the other. And this supplemental agreement, initially signed in June 2021, was designed to auto-terminate after 18 months. Unless, and it's very explicit in the supplemental letter, unless it was properly extended. And given that the service commencement date conditions were not met, namely that PREPA exited Title III bankruptcy, there was a push in November 2022 to extend it. And that extension was also signed by all three parties. So the fight that the governor and her representatives are waging right now, and the energies are, Josue Colon, are fighting right now, is not on technical grounds. It's on an invalid extension grounds. And it's not about a breach of contract. It's not about damages or performance or key metrics pertaining to the grid, outages, duration, frequency. It's not about payments or anything else. It is strictly about whether or not the contract extension was entered into illegally. And the key argument here, and Tom, I want us to sort of steel man the government's argument here because it's putting ourselves in their shoes and giving them the benefit of the doubt that this is beyond just a political battle, and we're going to talk about the political battle here as well. But assuming they have the strongest argument possible, their key argument here is that although PREPA signed as a party, that participation was nominal because the Fiscal Oversight and Management Board, the government watchdog created under PROMESA, is duly responsible for acting on behalf of PREPA given the bankruptcy proceedings in federal court. Now, and I'll finish here. This is the key point of the entire case and precisely why I think the government will ultimately lose. Because LUMA is arguing and the FOMB concur that this entire mess should be handled in federal court, overseen by the Southern District of New York, U.S. District Court, and the same judge that's overseeing the bankruptcy proceeding, Lauren Taylor Swain. The LUMA contract is the most significant contract that PREPA has entered into. And because PREPA is in bankruptcy and the Oversight Board and PROMESA entered into effect prior to LUMA's contracting, and that PREPA, because of its bankruptcy, is being represented by the FOMB, this is a federal matter and should be managed by the FOMB at a federal level. And it takes the ball out of the hands of the P3A and who's the nominal administrator for the contract and out of local courts. So they're arguing that PREPA was not acting under their own control, but that this should be handled in local courts. And the FOMB and LUMA are saying, no, PREPA is a signatory to the contract extension. It was entered into based on the previously agreed upon rulings. And this is all being administered by the FOMB at the federal level. And so that's sort of a backdrop and sort of a high level of where we are right now. But there's a lot of implications to that we're going to get into. Tom, thinking about that timeline, what may I have missed, and what are your thoughts on where we are?
Yeah, I mean a couple of things, more nuances than anything else. The conditions for the start of the contract, the main contract with Luma, one of the conditions was the bankruptcy, but another one was deposit of a certain amount of money for to be used for working capital purposes. And it was greater than $500 million. Some forms of that money came through, but this has always been the beginning of a point of contention about working capital, about grants and other things. But as you say, none of that is pertinent to the current arguments that are being placed. I think it's a little rich of a government to go, oh, the contract was valid. We screwed up, so it doesn't exist. Um, that's uh, that's usually not a good legal argument. And I think the other thing is, perhaps I'm mistaken, but this did come before Swain for the purposes of jurisdiction, and she effectively turned them away for this stuff being in her jurisdiction or in the jurisdiction of the federal courts at that time. And part of that, I think, is because of the nature of the complaint so far, that and the pathway taken by government is such that it probably needs to be resolved in the courts in Puerto Rico first. But of course, as a territory, everything is subject eventually to federal second guessing, and this wouldn't end with a decision in Puerto Rico.
I think there's also a key point of that, which is her courtroom as it pertains to the bankruptcy proceedings generally has been relatively, I want to say, hands off in terms of trying to encourage the different parties to come to an arrangement judiciously to avoid what may ultimately happen in general and in the specific case of who takes over operations of the grid, which is a court mandated operator or court mandated solution. And I think there's a high degree of reticence to actually initiate what would be a slippery slope into that outcome. And so you may be right that they're sort of, we don't want to set the precedent. We're going to push it back to local courts. We're going to push it back to local decision makers. Try to figure out a way to mediate this before it comes before my bench. I think we're somewhat destined for that process to fail. And I don't know a better example than the fact that we're in the ninth year of PREPA's and entering the, going to be later this year, the 10th year of PREPA's bankruptcy. That is a failure in many regards to actually come to some conclusive end, a piece of punctuation at the end of this very long, poorly managed process. I think you mentioned something with regards to the poor legal defense that PREPA and the government may have it on their hands. Let's take into consideration that when PREPA signed the extension, Josue Colon was the then president of PREPA and is now the head of the P3A and the governor's energy czar, leading the charge on behalf of the government in PREPA, which was, they're arguing, is signed illegitimately. So this seems like an obvious conflict of interest. It would suggest recusal at the very least, or some type of arm's length engagement with this process. The appearance of impropriety is there. He will likely be a material witness in court due to his previous role. And if he had a material role in shaping or signing the agreements and now has a material role in shaping the legal attack against them, the legal challenge aside, it shows serious ineptness and sloppiness from the government and has a serious impact on the credibility of the case in the first place and of the government generally. It also ironically helps LUMA because that's the argument they can say, which is you said if you had a material impact on the way these agreements were set up, you may have sabotaged the process from the very beginning because you wanted LUMA to fail. And given what we know about acts of sabotage, not that this is on Josue Colon's lap or he had anything to do with them, but given the acts of sabotage that were performed in 2020 when LUMA officially took over as a result of the privatization of the operations, I think there's a legitimate case to be made that this whole act is being done in bad faith.
Well, it is bad faith. I mean, it's from the beginning. It's been in bad faith. It's one thing to uh, you know, use a scapegoat politically, but it's quite another to go after a group, and it just doesn't make sense. And I think after a year of this administration, I think it's time to kind of call it. They're intellectually corrupt and basically criminally incompetent. And I don't say they're criminally corrupt. But this is this mix of policies. Where is it leading? It's leading nowhere good. So you might think that you'd be using this as an ability to renegotiate. We've seen these tactics at federal level, sometimes used successfully internationally, but it's not conducive to a good long-term performance from any of the parties. We have an interesting year ahead of us, regardless of the outcome of this particular case. But I
So
think yeah, yeah.
so let's talk about the outcomes here because putting political theater and the performative nature of this aside, we'll get to that in a moment. Putting that aside, let's sort of game out what are the outcomes here. I mean, based on the facts of the matter and based on the case itself, it seems like LUMA has a very strong angle to say, nope, the extension was entered into, the agreement initially was entered into legitimately, the extension was entered into legitimately, it was signed legitimately by the parties that needed to sign it, And given the bankruptcy, you guys have a mess on your hands, but at the end of the day, it's not LUMA's fault that this was entered into, or any indication it was entered into illegitimately. Based on that, I see Luma as the favorite to come away with this, not unscathed, but ultimately victorious in the eyes of the court.
Well, yes, whether that's whether that holds true through the ultimate decision in the Puerto Rico courts, or whether it's something that eventually has to be determined through the junta or with federal intervention. No one can afford to allow the chaos and the vacuum that would ensue with a determination and the ousting of Luma. And by the way, if Luma's agreement isn't worthwhile, that's got to call into question Eneret's as well. Whether it's done or not. Now they're not currently in the process of challenging those agreements, but
But they are in the midst of similar battles with regards to payments and therefore payments to vendors, and this kind of political, excuse me, a public facing attack on performance, and then a legal battle on the contract legitimacy. And that's
right.
where I think there's and that's where I think there's you certainly open the door to losing your grid operator and your
you're
generation
you're
operator.
you're already in bankruptcy, right? And the obligations that are owed to, like, we've talked about this last year at different points about the contractors for Luma who hadn't been paid, or they hadn't received the money from the tariffs or from this PREPA, et cetera, really from PREPA, because the money comes in, the money goes to PREPA, it goes through PREPA accounts. You can argue that it shouldn't, but realistically, it does have to. But and then PREPA doesn't give it to Luma to pay its creditors. So its creditors are strung along, on long waits, for their payments. If you now start challenging it and calling into question whether or not those amounts are due at all, then the whole thing is going to shut down faster than anybody makes a decision, because people are just going to not work, right? The contractors are going to go, no, we're not taking on any more work for you. It's like, I know you got government grants, I know you, but there's this corruption in the middle, which is PREPA and the government of Puerto Rico, and we need to know that money is going to flow to us, and in a reasonable time frame and on reasonable terms that we agreed to, so that we can spend our money and hire people and get in equipment and make the changes and do things like that. And if that is called into question, you're in bankruptcy already. You can't have a bankruptcy within a bankruptcy. So, like, these claims cannot be voided in the normal course of things. And your doomsday scenario about no money coming in and no work getting done and the system not being able to be maintained, now, instead of a bumpy ride, which we're hoping was going to get better as things changed, is now kind of a very bumpy, steeper curve downward for the performance of the grid, just really as things were beginning to start to come together. So
It reminds me of the old Soviet joke of we pretend to work and they pretend to pay us. And
yes.
this, the downside is this isn't a factory. It's the most critical underlying infrastructure for all activity in Puerto Rico, and we're already in a crisis mode. The factory is not churning out viable widgets anymore. So let's put our hats on and say, let's say the government wins and the Luma contract is considered invalid from November 2022 until today. what happens. And I think, I've got a whole series of implications here. You alluded to a couple of them, but let's go through them. First off, there's no replacements. And the government has said they've got a couple of different people lined up. I don't believe it one bit.
Yes.
It's BS. And the FOMB has made very clear. Actually, let me take a step back because we'll get into this as well. What's shocking about this is that when the governor announced that they would be bringing this lawsuit and pursuing the cancellation of LUMA's contract, they blindsided their federal partners. They blindsided their partners in the Fiscal Oversight Board. They blindsided their legislative partners, the regulators. Everybody was blindsided by this, including folks that had meetings with them that same day. And so the idea that you're going to do this in a cogent, thought out, strategic way because you care about the outcome is elided by all of the facts of how it actually happened. And that should be a key red flag that we have front and center in this whole thing, which is I want to give benefit of the doubt here to the extent that I can and say there was a deliberative effort with strategic value here, and that's sort of where we've led the conversation. We're going to get into why ultimately I think we both believe it to be political theater and performative, and what that means and the implications of that. But assuming it's not, there is no evidence that it was done in a proper way where you actually the importance of the outcome is front and center. And that is a deep concern, this whole thing. So the FOMB has made clear that no newcomer, no potential replacement of LUMA is going to get a better deal than the one that LUMA got. Right, so that's important. And it's going to go through a competitive process, and it's going to be at a very strict control of the same, the same benefits with much higher risks for anybody that comes beyond. And we'll get into those risk premiums here in a moment. The banks
Yeah.
the bankruptcy continues without an operator, which kicks off an even faster deceleration of the vicious circle we're in. The grid's performance continues to deteriorate at an even more expensive pace. We see grid defections and collections by the utility decrease at a steady rate. Without adequate collections, ratepayers bear an increasingly heavy burden, while bondholders associated with the bankruptcy have an ever murkier path to repayment. The Puerto Rico Electric Power Authority becomes strictly uninvestable, even more so than it is now because it's in bankruptcy. But it all of a sudden becomes even if you can divide by zero, we end up achieving a mathematical anomaly there. And Puerto Rico's government proves itself to be a bad friend to private capital that the island desperately needs, and effectively blocks all roads to growth and prosperity. That's sort of the high level. If the government wins, you have lost. Now, there's a couple of immediate operational considerations here. Who runs the grid next? Replacement capacity here is a key constraint. Even if you have interested parties lined up, it's not going to be easy to get them through the procurement process and approval process. It's going to be incredibly expensive. And it's not like LUMA disappears tomorrow because somebody still has to operate the grid. So what does that look like in terms of an additional supplemental agreement that says, okay, the agreement since 2022 is void, but we need you to stay on to continue to render services, which I don't understand how the legality of that seems mind-blowingly impossible. You have a multi-year accounting war over clawbacks and payments from November 2022 onward. You have regulatory limbo regarding the rate review and cost recovery and performance metrics and legitimately incurred expenses. You have this fight over the retroactively exploding regulatory rulings. Um, Grid repairs and O&M execution depend on federal funds that are going to grind to a halt. Audits, revised governance documentation, FEMA engagement, the annulment of funds in the pipeline, vendor uncertainty, which we already talked about, labor disputes, a credentialing nightmare. I can't even fathom to get into. A lot of litigation.
feeds back into industry. You're not going to get anybody to come in, right? I mean, Luma already stepped in, with a couple of other people who bid to actually help extract the system. I mean, they stepped in to catch a falling sword, right? I mean, that's what they did coming into a bankrupt entity. And now whoever's going to come in next, not only, if there is someone to come in next, has got to not only catch a falling sword, but do a sword dance at the same time to avoid its own ankles being cut off. And I
What you
mean,
might
if you
call a
think
sword
about
swallower catching a falling sword.
exactly. Yeah. It's like, well, it's one thing to stick it in slowly, but if it's coming at you at 100 miles an hour down, it's like, it's
Right.
going to go right through you. Uh, but the reason I mentioned the money that was supposed to be deposited, right, in the original contract is that like that doesn't go away. Somebody who's coming in here is going to look at this and go, oh, $500 million isn't enough. So we're not going to start this until you deposit $2 billion into an account, right? I mean, no one in their right mind would come in and in under the situation, anyone who's qualified, right? There may be lots of fly by night, unqualified people who might want to sign up to put something together. Maybe North Korea Electric will come in, but it's
John
highly,
Gang, Power and
highly
Light.
unlikely. Exactly.
There, the what you just mentioned opens up so many different areas of liability, and it's liability for the government having wrongly induced reliance or acceptance services, liability for Luma, who has been operating for the last 3 years or 4 years without valid authority. Consumer claims are going to expand, especially since we just saw DACO, the Consumer Affairs Office,
Right.
successfully win a case against Luma for damages, and that had to be then walked back politically because the reality is Luma is still an agent for the government, and when one government agency sues another, the ratepayer
Yeah.
or taxpayer bears that burden. And so Luma made it clear
Coming
before the
coming
case
back
that
to coming back to my comment about intellectually corrupt, right? I mean, if you were actually running an organized government that was intellectually and programmatically robust, you would have noticed at some point that the lawsuit that was being pursued was not in the best interest of the government, right?
and Luma, and look, I understand that Luma's their own party in that case, but they said as much, and
Yeah,
nobody on the other side wanted to give it a second's notice to say, we might actually not want to pursue this for it. And look, maybe the utility in an ideal world should bear more responsibility for
yeah,
damages. It's
I
not a
don't.
bad principle, but in the
I agree. I
reality
agree.
of the situation in Puerto Rico, the circumstances dictate there's no money to pay damages that don't come from Juan Pueblo, as they say, right? It is the
Yep.
people of Puerto Rico. It is the residents, the ratepayers, it's the businesses that depend on reliable operations. They're the ones that are going to pay for this. And so at the end of the day, you're just redistributing the same payment to the same people, right? So you either pay for your broken appliance and it sucks, or you pay for it through your electricity bill, which is no better.
Even
Except for
even
you
if
have
you
the scapegoat, which is Luma, which Luma's really,
right,
the face of a
even if
system-wide challenge.
even if you could find Luma individually liable for these types of things, and this is all about power surges, right, and ruined equipment, et cetera, and so it's an operational thing. But even if you could find that an employee of Luma deliberately, and it would have to be deliberate, right, for it to be where you would sue Luma and not the energy system. Your employee deliberately did something to my house that caused my stuff or my business to cause this stuff to fry, right? That would actually be an individual case where you could sue Luma. On the other hand,
Well,
Luma
it could
is
also be
also
negligent.
indemnified by PREPA for most of these types of acts. So it still would end up back because you're not going to take this sort of role on unless you've got a general indemnity. So,
Yeah, well, and this is where, the operator becomes the face of failure, but it's more in that case a lightning rod for it attracts all of the heat for a system that has been broken for a long time. And look, do not envy Luma's position here. I don't really envy any of these players' position here. But let's be honest, the infrastructure environment in Puerto Rico is deeply undercapitalized. It has been for decades. And the operator came in, but the failures that they're trying to address are legacy deferred maintenance, fuel supply volatility, federal procurement constraints, political interference, union and workforce permitting delays, FEMA, slowness and lethargy, fragmented responsibility. We could go on and on and on. And the issue is, again, Luma's a lightning rod for all of that.
why
This
don't
is
why don't we why don't we file a lawsuit against Luma and because their magic wand isn't working, right?
Yeah.
Apparently the public thinks that Luma came in, and the government seems to believe that Luma has, as a magic wand, and they can just wave it. They don't need capital, and everything is going to work, and everything is going to be beneficial, and the prices are going to go down, etc. So I think we should
so
sue them for falsely claiming that their magic wand was going to take care of everything.
we were talking about liability and being careful not to call them criminally corrupt. But in the and neither of us are lawyers, but the is there liability for decision makers for signing an invalid contract?
No, generally not.
Yeah. Okay. Well, there may be political liability, and we're going to get into the political, wins or consequences of this. Um, I just want to make it clear and reiterate that if a court declares that the extension was void and Puerto Rico, quote unquote, wins, future counterparties, if they exist in the first place, are going to price in the political reversal risk, the litigation risk, the payment risk, the federal oversight complexity, the reputational risk, and all of that show up as higher required returns, less bidder participation, and more aggressive contract protections, as you were just mentioning. And even if you are the most pro-government analyst of this situation, those are serious trade-offs that are going to be even if you agree Luma's failed not only in performance but failed to prove that their contract was legitimately entered into and the extension was legitimately entered into, those outcomes are relatively uncontroversial as far as I'm concerned. So even if you prove that, even if you prove that in the case of DACO that Luma doesn't have the immunity and indemnification for damages caused to appliances, for instance, even if you factor that in, the risks of winning and being right are enormous.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, and look, these actions that we're seeing are, by the government are trite. They're the actions that you would expect to see in term of art, but submerging economies, right? You've got emerging markets, emerging economies,
This is
but
a
you
submerging
also have
one.
seen, no, it's true, submerging economies, right? Submerging governments. So, typically you're talking about, corrupt people politics, and it doesn't have to be a big C corrupt, right? Big C corrupt for me is where people are gaming the system and taking millions and millions and millions out of it. So, you're bleeding the system for people to get wealthy, right? I mean, this isn't the U.S. government now, but it's basically what you would see and I have seen in certain economies in Africa, Asia, certain Latin American economies, and more in the past, where
Right,
it
Caribbean.
was
It's not.
you started to get some development, and now you're starting to make decisions and pass laws and do things that are going to cause, deliberately or not deliberately. In this case, I don't think it's deliberately trying to drive Puerto Rico down, in the direction of Haiti or somebody else, but these are the outcomes, right? This is the intellectual corruption, the failure to be able to understand and look at consequences of actions. And you're doing things that are in the short, medium, and long term uh, disinterest of the state of Puerto Rico.